my guests, Paul Freaker and Mike Mason, and all of you, our lovely audience. I can't hear you, I can see you, but I believe you are somewhere there. So today we are going to talk with Mike Mason, who is an award-winning game developer and a co-writer for Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. And he is the lead writer and editor for the Call of Cthulhu line at Chaosium. If you play Call of Cthulhu, you probably had something to do with his work, because he was part of Keeper's Rulebook, the starter set, Pulp Cthulhu, Investigator's Handbook, lately Malleus Monstrorum, Mask of Nyarlathotep. All those were his co-creations. And as far as Paul Freaker, he is a freelance writer and a game designer, also responsible for Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. He was engaged in the same, that is Keeper's Rulebook, Investigator Handbooks, Mask of Nyarlathotep, Two-Headed Serpent, Cthulhu Britannica, a lot of great positions. So I'm really happy you are here. I hope we will have a lovely conversation. And my first question for you is classic Cthulhu or pulp Cthulhu, and why?
Paul, you should go first.
Okay, I will. Well, I was thinking, it depends what mood I'm in, I suppose. It's hard to pick one above the other. It's like picking a favorite child. It depends on the day. But sometimes, if I sit down and watch a movie, sometimes I want to sit down and watch Indiana Jones. And some days I want to watch a film like Zodiac or The Exorcist or something like that. So I think they're both great games. I think it depends what mood you're in and what kind of game you want to play, because they deliver different experiences.
Yeah, I have to kind of agree with Paul. Really, it's really hard to choose between them. It really is, what you and your group of players are in the mood for, and the style of scenario. Where often I like the pacing of Pulp Cthulhu because it's quite quick, and I tend to run games quite quickly, so it suits me, that style. But as Paul says, sometimes the slow burn, kind of more dark and gritty kind of classic Call of Cthulhu is works really well. So it really depends on the mood.
But if one was going to get washed away, and you're only left with one, I guess it would be classic Call of Cthulhu for me.
Yeah, I think ultimately that's where it all comes from, isn't it? So because you can still have a pulp ethos even with just playing classic Cthulhu. You don't necessarily have to adopt all the pulp rules necessarily, but they help. But you have a wonderful basis to do anything you like with, I guess, if you start with classic Cthulhu.
Sure. So classic it is. And as far as 7th edition of Call of Cthulhu, you did converse all the rules, all system into the 7th edition. Can you tell us what has changed in this edition?
Well,
where do you even begin?
Ultimately, number one, the game hasn't changed. Ultimately, the style of game, what it is about, and kind of how you play it hasn't actually changed fundamentally. It still feels like playing the game that was released nearly 40 years ago. You're still playing Call of Cthulhu.
Sure.
And I think in terms of the 7th edition, the changes, what they are is modifications to that kind of classic basic role play rule set. And I'm going to shut up and let Paul pick something like what do you want to pick, Paul?
Sure. Yeah, no, like Mike says, it was key to us that the experience remained similar or very, very much similar, because we loved the game and we wanted people to be familiar with it. So we added in things like pushed rolls. So that's where you know, we want, I'm guessing most of this audience knows what that is, but some people sort of looked at that and thought, well, that's just a way of getting a second chance. But yes, it is. But fundamentally, it's about upping the tension, because there should be an element of risk. So it should make people sit on the edge of their seat and think, do I really want to roll these dice? Because I know I'm getting a second chance, but something really bad could happen. So we hope that intensified the experience of playing the game. Hand in hand with that, there were difficulty rolls, levels of difficulty. So it used to be that it was just a percentage system, very simple. You roll under your skill, you succeed. So we introduced, if you roll under half your skill, you know, if something is particularly, you know, more difficult, then it's a hard roll or even an extreme roll. And that allowed us from that springboard onto using that for opposed rolls. And then that changed combat as well, because then combat became more dynamic. And rather than I rolled hit you, then you rolled hit me, it was like a two-way experience where you were opposing each other, more akin to, you know, an actual action scene. That was the objective there. Yeah.
Sure. Do you prefer to answer the questions from the audience directly, or do you want to save them for the last part? Because we have already the first question.
However you want to, whatever you like to do. We're happy. I guess we're happy any way you want to do it.
Okay, so the first question from our audience is, why do you create stats for the old ones? Human will die when confronting them, and adding statistics adds impression they can actually be killed.
Well, I think number one, the stats for the old ones have kind of always been in the game, and we weren't looking to drastically alter the game in that way. We wanted to kind of keep the game as it was, in a sense. So they stay there. I think if you look in the latest kind of version of how the old ones are presented is in the new Malleus Monstrorum, and you see that that's a very cut down version of statistics, and in fact they are offered as a optional manifestation. They, you know, if you you want a kind of a great old one to physically appear in your game, manifest in some way, then you know, if we hadn't put them in, people would be saying, why, you know, what happens when Cthulhu appears? What can it do? You know, whatever we pick, somebody would take the opposite view, say, well, I you know, when Cthulhu appears at the end of my campaign, how do I know what it does? You know, and so by putting it in, you have the option to use it. You have the option to use it. If you don't want to use it, you don't have to. You can ignore the small box under each of the 2-page write-ups for each of the old ones, and ignore it. But if you want a kind of an idea, a base of what their powers might be, how they may interact in the actual, you know, heat of the moment in the game, then you have some detail there. So yeah.
I mean, I can remember when I first got Call of Cthulhu, looking through the book, and you get familiar with the rules. And I just loved looking at those big numbers associated with some of the great old ones. You know, you look at them and they've got, you know, strengths in the hundreds and thousands and so on. And as a keeper, I appreciate that. And I just enjoy looking at that and sort of thinking what that means. But when you play the game, the players don't see those numbers. You just portray this massive monster or whatever. So yeah, I think it's a bit of fun for the keeper as well.
I also looking at the question, does it give the players an impression that they can be killed? Well, great. If the players think they can be killed, then that's going to get the players into a lot more trouble and find out they can't be killed. I mean, that's no bad thing. Often humans often underestimate the threat until they're deep in the middle of it, and then they realize they shouldn't have done that.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so I would like to ask you about this conversion. Where do you even start converting the old system to the new system in role-playing games? From which point you start the process?
the process was a kind of an evolution. Myself and Paul, when we started, we literally just sat down with the whatever the latest version of the rulebook, the 6th edition, and we just went page by page through the book, and basically kind of whenever we got to something, we kind of would sort of discuss it and say, do people actually use this rule? Does it work? When you get to the grappling rule in 6th edition, it was clear that it didn't work because no one understood it. Because you would ask anyone, how does grappling work? Everyone would have a different opinion. And there wasn't actually a codified way of doing it. And so it was a problem. So we could identify what were rules that kind of needed more work or needed, attention, and which were just, which rules were just fine, that didn't really need any changes, as it were. They work. And we kind of started that very, very mechanical kind of process of going through the book and looking at it and thinking, does this help the game? Ultimately, does this help in a game of Call of Cthulhu? Does it help? And that's kind of the question we kind of asked ourselves as we went through the book. That's kind of how we started.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of communication between the two. Yeah, just a lot of communication between myself and Mike. We'd speak on the phone regularly. We still do. And I'd write a bit, Mike would read it, he'd feed back to me. It was a very kind of a two-way process, which sometimes led us down, avenues that we'd explore and then pull back from and develop. So there was a lot of exploration, I suppose. Yeah.
I can't remember that part. Was it like 4 years? We kind of spent 4 years going through different versions, trying things out, testing things, rewriting things over the course of 4 years. That was kind of the process.
Yeah.
It was 4 years just for the core book?
Yeah.
Well, the keeper book and the investigator handbook that sort of work hand in hand.
Yeah, they kind of came together.
That sounds like a lot of work. Thank you for that. Okay. Do you have any most interesting part of this process that you liked the most, the conversion process?
For me, I think it's always when it's the two of us, we have an ongoing discussion all the time, and we agree on things and we disagree on things, and we bash it out till we both agree on it. And that's just the process of writing. But in terms of the bigger process for Call of Cthulhu, I think it's when things go out to play testing, because they confirm or surprise you in the feedback. And there are often kind of new rules that such as luck spending, where we kind of, before we put out the playtest, we kind of knew that some people would like it, but we also knew some people wouldn't like it, but we weren't sure what the kind of balance of opinion would be. So when the actual playtesting went out to, 1,000 players or more, and we had the feedback come in, and then we actually crunched the numbers statistically at the end in terms of, what people liked, what people didn't like. And the luck spend was interesting because it was 50% people liked it, 50% people didn't like it, which kind of doesn't help us really. Because, 50% like it, 50% don't like it. Does that mean we have it in? So what we were able to do is say, well, actually, we can keep it in, but we can just make it an optional rule. Therefore, the 50% of people that like it have got it in the rule book and can use it, and the 50% that don't like it, it's an optional rule, so they can ignore it. And so that was kind of interesting, kind of getting feedback like that.
That's the great solution for, I think, optional rules. We have 2 more questions from the audience. The first one, is there a chance for a pulp campaign will be released comparable in size to Masks of Nyarlathotep or Horror on the Orient Express?
I think,
Do you have any plans?
the answer is kind of, we have kind of done that. I mean, in terms of the English language Call of Cthulhu, Paul, in fact, was one of the co-writers of one of the campaigns, The Two-Headed Serpent, which is comparable to Masks in that you travel to many different countries, and it's a very kind of involved and sometimes complicated plot, but played through Pulp Cthulhu. I think it's comparable to Masks in the sense of it's an epic kind of world-spanning adventure with different kind of cults and things in play, and can be and it reaches a kind of a potentially world-ending climax. So it's very similar to Masks, but plays differently and is about different things. So I think in a sense that kind of is partly the answer. There's also a Cold Fire Within, which is a pulp campaign, but that's a kind of focus down. You're not traveling around the world, but you are traveling in kind of one region and exploring into the unknown, really, with that one. So it's a kind of a very slightly different take on the kind of the world-spanning campaign.
Sure.
I don't know, Paul, do you want to say anything on your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the questioner is perhaps asking, a campaign as big as Masks, because Masks and Orient Express are both really massive in terms of their page count.
Yes,
and
I think
they're probably 2 or 3 times the length of Two-Headed Serpent.
Yeah.
Yes,
Now,
I think the question was about the size.
Yeah. So I wonder if a pulp campaign of that scale would work, because it's inherent in pulp that it's very action-driven. Stuff resolves more speedily. So I wonder if the ideal the ideal classic Cthulhu campaign can be really big and go on for years, whereas the ideal pulp campaign, it never occurred to me before, but perhaps is a slimmer book, more like Two-Headed Serpent.
I think the difference it comes down to fundamental differences between pulp and classic Cthulhu. Classic Cthulhu is very detailed by the very nature of what it is. It's very, very detailed. The clues are very detailed. The interconnections are very detailed in a classic Call of Cthulhu scenario, let alone a campaign. And that just makes you just need more words to describe that often. Whereas in Pulp Cthulhu, it is much more fastly paced game where actually it's not necessarily so much about how you find the clues, it's what you do with them and what the clues mean sometimes. It's the pace of the game, I think, makes it different. I think I would agree with Paul in terms of the pacing of the game is somewhat different to classic Cthulhu.
And one more thing, in the latest edition of Pulp Master and the Architect, we have put in stats and advice for running it with pulp, so you could argue that it's a pulp stroke classic campaign now.
Yeah, well, indeed, not only Masks can be run with all the pulp guidance in there, but we've just released the Children of Fear, which is written for classic Cthulhu, but again there is guidance throughout everything for how to run it with Pulp Cthulhu. So we try and include the pulp or the classic side into what we do, so you can play with it in whatever style you want to play.
We have another question about pulp, so I will add it to our conversation. What do you think about how Pulp Cthulhu fits within original assumptions for the game, where humans was supposed to be weak and doomed? When you put heroes in the picture, doesn't it take something special away from the system? What are your opinions about that?
I don't think it does. I think there's no character in Pulp. While Pulp Cthulhu characters are tougher, they have double the hit points of classic Cthulhu characters, and they have a couple of potentially they're able to do some really cool kind of things through their pulp traits and things, their talents. They're not indestructible, and they still have a finite resource. They have finite luck. They have finite hit points, and even though maybe a ghoul is no necessarily a big match for a pulp character, a whole pack of ghouls would be, and the bigger monsters that would. All that pulp does is give your characters a slightly better chance of staying alive a bit longer if they meet a star spawn, whereas opposed to a classic Cthulhu, a star spawn would just sort of stomp all over everyone and the characters would be pretty powerless. it gives a false sense of security in actuality, and the sanity system is not changed. I mean, while in pulp you can kind of buy off some sanity losses, potentially you can't buy them all off, and you will still spiral downwards. So either insanity or death will potentially come to you. It just may take longer to do in pulp, and that's kind of the point. It allows the characters a little bit more agency, but ultimately the pulp characters are still pretty insignificant if they're standing next to Cthulhu or some other giant being kind of thing. So I don't think it
doomed.
In fact, it could heighten the horror in some ways, because the characters are a little bit more powerful. They think they're more powerful, but when they actually meet something they're powerless against, it's all the more, all the more fear in a way.
Yes. Paul, and what is your thoughts about your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the questioner asks, when you put the heroes in the picture, does it take something away from the system? I mean, I don't mind saying, yeah. I mean, in a way, you've got the two. If you want to see it as two takes on the game, or two games, your pulp Cthulhu and your classic Cthulhu, we don't want them to be the same, because why would we produce two games that are exactly the same? There's no point. So if you want to play the classic Cthulhu, and you've got the very gritty horror, and you've got humans who are very vulnerable, but still, they can still go through a lot of stories, and if they're played intelligently. And then you've got the pulp Cthulhu, where, and arguably, they are more durable. So that is a slightly different game. It's like you've got a set of dials on your game, from gritty horror to pulp horror, from very vulnerable humans to more heroic, bigger than life characters, and you can play with those dials. So I think taking away the phrase implies that you're lessening something. I mean, perhaps you are, but you're turning the other dial up.
Okay. So now I would like to ask you about your creative process. Do you have any work routine? Do you have any favorite books or places where you look for inspirations? Any tools, dictionaries you prefer to work with?
Well, I know Mike gets up at 5 a.m. every morning and has a cold bath. And then, isn't that right? Then you do does 2 hours of yoga.
Yeah, 2 hours of yoga, but you do it easy. You've got that big book on your desk, isn't it? You just roll a dice, and you've got all these rewritten. You bought it. It's got all these ideas that you just roll a dice. That's a scenario, and you just kind of write it out, don't you?
It's like a find your own adventure.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. No, it's chaos. Is a true answer? Do I have a working process? Yeah, I think on the whole, when I'm working with Mike's got a framework, a proposal, a scheme, and we'll discuss it and slowly develop it between the two of us. What would you say, Mike? I mean, I'm not sure I've got. What are we asking? A daily process, or just a?
I think. I mean, I kind of guess it's the writing process. I kind of guess rather than anything else. I mean, for me, I mean, and obviously the question is, how do you write a scenario? Well, there's 101 answers to that, because everyone writes their scenarios differently. For me, I have an initial kind of idea, which could be anything. It could be the end of the scenario. It could be the beginning of the scenario. It could be, wouldn't this character be cool, and kind of make a scenario out of it? Or I'd really love to set a scenario in a tree house. Can I think of something that would work? It could be anything. And then I will think it through, and I'll write a very sketchy kind of plot, as in, who does what and why, and what the outcome might be. And then that's my kind of sketch. And then I'll write headings. I'll kind of think the scenario through logically and think, well, okay, so there needs to be a start scene. And after the start scene, they need to meet this guy, and then they need to go to this place. And I'll literally just put them in as headings. And so I kind of got like a skeleton of the scenario just in headers. And then I fill them in. And then I fill them in with bullet points and then text. That's kind of my process. And when I get to a point where I don't know something and I need to do some research, I'll go off and do the research to fill in that gap. That's the kind of way I work. But other people work very differently to that. Paul, I mean, I don't think you don't work quite the same way, do you, Paul? I don't think.
No, I wouldn't say so. But I totally agree, Mike. As soon as I started working with other people on scenarios, I came to appreciate just how differently people work. I think we all have the impression that other people, work in a similar way to the way you do, but they don't. They have different starting points. Some people do loads of research, and their scenario springs out of the research. Some people do it the other way around, where they write the scenario and then it occurs to them, you know what, maybe I should do some research about this. I am guilty of doing that. Yeah, I tend to work in a bit of I tend to get a sort of a concept or an idea that I think is interesting, and then sort of expand out from that, sort of backwards and forwards. So it's and then, like Mike said, then try and get a framework down. And the more scenarios I've done, the more I try and sort of work with the framework. And I find actually putting it into the format that we use for Chaos Sim scenarios is actually a good method for me to put structure on the scenario.
I mean, whilst I start with that initial kind of sketch plan of the plot, when I'm writing it, it often completely changes, and I actually end up writing a different scenario because that's what, that's where my or I've suddenly discovered something in the plot that actually is far more interesting and more cool than my original kind of idea. But I guess you kind of have to be somewhat flexible. But yeah.
Yeah, 100% agree.
We have a question about research, so I will ask you, how have you read some theoretical texts about building horror story, which inspire you the most?
I can't say there's
theoretical horror.
Yeah, I can't say there's a particular textbook about horror that I would say, well, that's the one that I learned everything from. I have to, in reality, what happened is when I was a kid, I really loved horror books, and I loved horror films, and I like sci-fi novels. And so when I was quite young, I would read lots of horror and science fiction short stories. And then as I've got older, I've continued to read different ones, and I've watched lots of horror films, and I've read various papers on horror, what the meaning of horror and things like that. And they've all coalesced in my head over the years to give me my kind of view on horror and the different styles of horror. It is very much a case of a lot of reading and watching good and very bad horror films to kind of give me an opinion of what I think works or doesn't work, I guess, ultimately. But it would be pretty hard to sort of pinpoint any one thing that is the answer, as it were.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm a little wary of getting into the theory of horror. When I watch films, I love watching horror films and so on. What I don't like watching is the extras on the DVD that show you how the special effects were done, because then when I watch it again, I'm just seeing in my mind how the special effects were done. I don't like watching how people direct films and so on, because then when I'm watching the film, part of me is then aware, oh, these are just actors acting it out, and I don't like that. I'm very conscious of that, so I don't really want to read about this how to write novels. That doesn't really interest me, because I think then I would be looking at it from a technical point of view. I think it's important to have a good writing craft and try to improve that. But like Mike, I'm more interested in reading novels and stories and experiencing the films, and then just trying to put that feeling into what I write.
The one thing I'd add is when I think when I was about 17, I went to a fantasy and horror convention. It was a literary one, so it was really just about writers, people like Ramsey Campbell were there doing talks and things like that. And all of them, every kind of famous author that was on a panel, the advice they gave that stuck with me, and I've always tried to do, was to, their advice was, don't just read horror and science fiction. Read read really good stuff that's considered classics. Read Shakespeare, read Dickens, read whatever it is. It doesn't have to be horror. You expand your reading and your horizons, and that will all help you build your basis of becoming a better, more informed writer. And I think that's still important. I think people can get quite focused down on only reading Lovecraft, let's say, when actually there's a lot of other things to read that are will be useful in terms of informing you and your craft in that way.
Basically, just read good literature for being a
good writer, as well as it's not either or. It's read that in between reading Ramsey Campbell stories or August Derleth stories. Read some Dickens or read some Ian M. Banks or whoever it may be. Expand your reading list, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because you can only benefit from that. It will never do you any harm. You can only improve by doing it. It's like Anna may have.
Yeah.
Oh, no, like you're frozen for a moment.
Yes, I'm frozen too, I think.
No, we've got you, Anna.
Okay, we're back.
You're back now.
Yeah,
okay,
we're
back.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Because we are talking about literature, I would like to ask you about your favorite Lovecraft story. Do you have any?
All right. I mean, it changes from year to year for me. It used to be The Color Out of Space, I would have said, but I think on the podcast that I do, we talked about the Dunwich Horror a couple of years ago, and rereading that and going over it in more detail. There's just so much stuff in it, and I really enjoyed the experience of reading the story again. So I'd probably pick the Dunwich Horror. It's a great tale. I like the kind of maybe it's because it's got all that farming background. Like my family were a farming background, so I can kind of relate to all that stuff. But yeah, what about you, Mike? What would you say if you had to pick one? What was your?
Well, I mean, when I first read Lovecraft and I was reading, all of his stories and that, there's one story that actually, was the one that that had moments that actually kind of, I could put myself in the position of the character I was reading, and I could feel, I wasn't actually scared, but I could feel the fear that the character would have. And so, in a sense, I was scared. And that story was the Dunwich Horror, because it's that bit when they're phoning each other, the farms are phoning each other. There's something coming, or such and such's farm has just been destroyed. There's something outside. And it's that kind of sense of fear, that the fear of the unknown that was conveyed through that fiction that really kind of touched me. And so, perhaps for that, that's always been my favorite Lovecraft story, because it's got a bit of everything. It's not just, you've got mad wizards and elder gods, and you've got, strange kind of family cults and the university and professors. It's kind of, if one story's got everything in it, that's the story that's got everything in it, I guess.
Yeah, that bit when it talks about bringing the old ones back, when he's looking at the book and everything, it gets really pretty deep into the mythos as well. Yeah,
that's not to say I don't like the other stuff. I love Color Out of Space and Mountains of Madness and all that kind of thing, but Dunwich Horror is just kind of cool, really.
Yes, it is. Okay, so I would like to ask you about the Polish RPG scene. Do you have any experiences with Polish gamers, with Polish keepers, and what do you think about them? What do you think? Is Polish RPG community somehow different from English one?
I mean, my experience is fairly limited. I mean, I went to the Carcosa-Con, the first one. What would be
It was 2 years ago.
3 years ago now, before the pandemic. And I had a really great time, playing games and meeting with, the different kind of Call of Cthulhu players, from the Polish community. And my experience, and obviously I work closely with Black Monk Games in terms of what they're putting out, because obviously a lot of what they put out is translations of the work, mine and Paul's work and Kurzium's work. So I work quite closely with the team at Black Monk, and they're lovely to work with. My impression, to sum all that up, my limited impression is that Polish role players are pretty much like role players around the world. They enjoy the same things. We're playing the same game, and they get the same kind of fun and enjoyment out of the game that me and my English group do. And when I go to America and play at Gen Con, I find the players are having they're laughing at the same things. They're running away from the same things. At the end of the day, it's very encouraging that we're all enjoying the same game. We're kind of maybe not all playing exactly the same, but more or less. But we're all getting the same kind of enjoyment out of the game, and that's kind of what I've learned really about that. And so I think the Polish community is great. I mean, I think they're one of the most active communities that I've seen at the moment in terms of their the material that Black Monk are putting out, the Polish scenarios that are coming out on the Miskatonic repository, that are not only coming out in Polish but also getting translated to English. And so there's a real kind of vibe, a real kind of things are really happening in Poland. There's a lot of people embracing Call of Cthulhu and really running with it, which is fantastic. So that's kind of my impression of Poland. There's a lot happening, and it's all very exciting.
Mm-hmm. And do you, Paul, have any experiences with Poles playing RPGs?
I regret to say that no, I've not had the pleasure of visiting Poland. I've had this question put to me, about how to compare, say, American gamers with British gamers. And I think there's such a diversity. If I were to try and sum up British gamers, it's very difficult, because I can go to one group or to another group, and the experiences are very different. So, trying to compare nationalities, we just end up with stereotypes, I think. And I don't know if that's very helpful, but I know that from my own experience with the podcast, we have quite a lot of listeners in Poland, and I'm pleased that I think that one of my scenarios, the Full Fathom 5, is getting translated into Polish soon. So I'm looking forward to that, and I look forward to perhaps coming and visiting a convention when things are better, and look forward to it.
Mm. And do you know any Polish scenarios? Do you have any favorite Polish scenarios? I know not a lot of them were translated into English, but this is one of our audience's question.
Ah, right. Okay. So I regret to say no, I don't. I'm sure Mike's more familiar with them than I am. I know there was the translation of "Does Love Forgive"? Is that it? Yeah,
I was just about to say the same thing, Paul. The ones I'm most familiar with are the ones I've spent time kind of working on, and that's the what in English was translated as "Does Love Forgive?" The one-on-one Call of Cthulhu scenarios, which were fun to work on and see something coming from Poland in that way. So that was really cool. And I've kind of not really had, unfortunately, because there's so many adventures that are published to the Miskatonic repository, it gets to a point where it's just almost impossible to read them all because there's so many. But certainly I do take a look at the ones that are coming out from Poland, because their presentation is very good, and so they stand out. And so I can't choose between them, but you know,
Sure.
the kind of skim read I've had of the ones that have come out so far have all been, you know, they've all looked like they would be a lot of fun to play. I just haven't got around to being able to play them myself, but they certainly look good.
We have another question from our audience. Is Call of Cthulhu popular in Asian countries like Japan or China? Do you know anything?
Is it
about
popular in
Asian-
Japan?
It's big in Japan.
Apparently, yeah.
So
Go
I
on,
heard.
Mike. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Japan, Call of Cthulhu is very popular in Japan. In fact, we understand it. You know, we work closely with we have a Japanese licensee, and we understand through them that, and well, in fact, it's borne out through things like Roll20 and other online platforms that Call of Cthulhu is the biggest game in terms of role playing in Japan. It's bigger than Dungeons and Dragons in that way. I think it's mainly because Call of Cthulhu kind of came first in Japan rather than D&D, but certainly it's very, very popular. And there's the tradition of what are called replay books in Japan, where people kind of fictionalize the gameplay in a kind of a novel or comic form, and they're very popular, and they also help to inspire other people to then get into the game as well. So it is very, very popular in Japan, and there is definitely a growing number of players in the kind of wider Asian area as well.
And I see a lot of titles in Korean on the Miskatonic repository as well. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a South Korean licensee who are doing some really, really cool translations and books themselves that are coming out as well. So you know, a lot is happening in that area, and you know, it continues to grow. It's just the same as Poland. They are bringing out really cool things, and it's really nice to see Call of Cthulhu, you know, growing, you know, in the non-English speaking world. In that sense, it's really cool to see, you know, books in Japanese and Korean and Polish and so on.
All of them are so difficult languages to write Cthulhu in. Okay, I have some more questions to you about your projects. Do you have any projects you are most proud of? You would call it your favorite child?
Go on, Paul. You can answer that easy.
Yeah. Okay. I think, you know, if I had to pick one that I'm most pleased with, it's probably Two-Headed Serpent, the pulp campaign, because I think it's had a really good reception. I hear a lot of people playing it and enjoying it. And I think of all the projects I've worked on, the thing that I get most out of is when I hear of people playing it and enjoying it. Because if something just gets published and then you never hear anything else about it, you know, it's like, well, what did I do that for? But with Two-Headed Serpent, yeah, it just seems very alive, I guess. It just seems very alive and played and loved. And I think it's a fun campaign and one that I'm proud of. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Two-Headed Serpent for you. And you, Mike?
I find this question really hard because I like all the books I've worked on. So, but I think I'm proud to have got Pulp Cthulhu out, because it was announced by Chaosium something like 30 years ago and never came out. So it's quite good to actually get a product that should have been released 30 years ago out now, and in a way that has been so well received by people, that people have you know, really kind of understood what it tries to be, and that it's, you know, it's just a slightly different style of playing Call of Cthulhu, which I think works for some people that want that kind of style. It's not for everyone, but it is for some people. I'm glad that we've able to offer what is essentially a version of Call of Cthulhu to some people who may not so readily enjoy classic Cthulhu. It's not their style of game. So I guess that's really cool for me. And I think, you know, it's always kind of your last book you tend to think most about. But I mean, I'm quite proud about the kind of work that went into the Malleus Monstrorum, the new edition, because you know, I spent a lot of time working on that and racking my brain to think about how do I write what Azathoth is, and how do I get that across, and not just in a conceptual way, but in terms of how can I use Azathoth in the game. So it was kind of, you know, quite challenging at times to think about these different kind of not only monsters but kind of alien gods and how they actually integrate with the game, not just as concepts or narratives. So I guess I'm quite proud of that.
Okay, you started talking about your recent projects. Do you have any ongoing projects you can say something about?
I'm working with Mike and Lynn on a book called Rivers of London, role-playing game, which is not a Call of Cthulhu game, but it is an investigative game. So this is a game based on the novels by Ben Aronovich about a magic-wielding police officer called Peter Grant in London in the modern day. And yeah, that's quite a major project that we're working on at the moment. Hand in hand with that, I'm also working on republishing some scenarios on the Miskatonic repository. So I've got some titles that have been published before, but I'm bringing them up to date with 7th edition. So there's Dockside Dogs, there's Gatsby and the Great Race, and another scenario, My Little Sister. So those three I'm looking to try and get on the repository this year, I think. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah. Well, but never mind about the other two, but Gatsby and the Great Race will consume Paul's time, no doubt, because it's a monster of a scenario for various reasons. But it'll be very good to see that back out again. I know it's been getting, you know, me and Paul helped to run it again at Necronomicon a couple of years ago, and certainly there's a group of some American players that have been running that at American conventions, but it'd be nice to be able to get it out and see that being run elsewhere as well, because it's a real experience kind of game to play at the convention. That's a lot of fun. Myself, I've literally on Friday finished a new book which is called The Cults of Cthulhu. And that's a book that's been, well, Paul's had a hand in helping to edit some of it, but effectively it's been co-written by myself and Chris Lackey, who's one of the co-hosts on the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast. And it kind of is what it says as a title, The Cults of Cthulhu. It's all about the Cthulhu cult, or the cults of Cthulhu. So it details a range of Cthulhu cults, some of which you would be familiar with, like the trying to remember now, Esoteric Order of Dagon in Innsmouth. You know, that's a Cthulhu cult, and there's some ones you will be familiar with, some ones that you've never heard of, and it details those. And there are scenarios that there's 3 scenarios in the book, quite long ones, that kind of explore the Cthulhu cult in the Gaslight era, in the 1920s, 30s era, and in the modern day. And then between all of that, you have guidance on how to create a Cthulhu cult for the game, how to create a leader for your cult. There's various kind of new monsters that are kind of, you know, that are kind of Cthulhu-y aligned monsters. And there's also very new material on you know, what are called the Undying Masters. You know, in the Call of Cthulhu story by Lovecraft, he calls, you know, the deathless ones, and no one's really written about those in Call of Cthulhu. So we've written a large bit about the Undying Masters, who secretly control the cult, you know, from their hideouts around the world, and so that's all in there. So, you know, you can either just run the scenarios and use the cults as is, or use the guidance to, you know, develop your own version of the Cthulhu cult, basically. So I'm quite pleased that that's all coming together. That will be going into layout fairly soon. But that's the last thing I did.
That sounds great. I want to read this book, definitely. Okay, I would like to ask about projects that were difficult for you. Any hard experiences with tentacles or any other beings? Do you have any anecdotes that you could share with us? Something hard for you as a creator?
I would say it was more difficult than I expected. You're working on revising Masters and Archetype, because on the surface, I suppose, when Mike suggested it, it sounded like we'll revise it to 7th edition. Oh yeah, we'll just go through and update like the monster characteristic values and so on, and update some little bits of mechanics and so on. But then, you know, once you start, it was a bit like redecorating a room and taking the wallpaper off with your fingernails, because you'd pull a little bit off and then there'd be another layer and there'd be a bit more and you'd tear a bit and then you'd realize it felt a bit like being an investigator in a Call of Cthulhu scenario, because as you started to delve into this campaign, which was, you know, well loved by thousands of people and has been around for decades.
Yes.
You know, it's just so much to peel back and to rework, and obviously you got to try and stay as close as you can to the original text whilst updating it. So it was a fun thing to do, but there was a lot of a lot more work and challenging parts than I'd perhaps anticipated. But I'm very pleased with how it came out.
I know what you're talking about. I played the old version of Masks of Nyarlathotep, and then I translated the new one, so I know both of them.
Right, yes, you know it well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to agree with Paul that apart from writing 7th edition, because that was fairly challenging at times, the most challenging, I think, has been Masks, because particularly from my point of view, because obviously whilst, you know, each of us were leads on particular chapters, you know, I kind of worked on the England chapter, Paul worked on Australia and something else, can't remember that.
The Kenya chapter.
And then my other job was everything. So writing the individual chapters was a lot of fun. It was hard work, kind of restitching together, spotting potential gaps in the original or opportunities in the original text that hadn't really been explored, and exploring those in the kind of individual chapters. The challenge for me was, after I'd written that chapter, was then making sure everyone else's chapters hung together well, and that the internal navigation, you know, the clue threads throughout, the character threads, the information, the referencing, and just how we presented the information was done in a consistent way across different authors. Meant that I, you know, read Masks of Nyarlathotep about 300 times in the course of the year. So it was fairly challenging, because by the end of it, I really didn't want to look at it again, because I had read it.
And how is your sanity?
But I'm now, having, you know, some time passed, I'm very pleased with the work we all did on it. I think it really stands up well, and I think it made what was already a fantastic campaign even better. I think it, you know, smoothed some of the sharp edges and added in layers of opportunity for groups to explore that perhaps weren't in the original. So I think, you know, apart from being proud of that, I think it was a challenge to do, but I'm very pleased with the result that came out of it.
No, I think perhaps it just makes it easier as well for new people to get into it, because it's obviously worked for like 3 decades. It's worked for people, but I think those people it's worked for have put a lot of work into making it work for themselves, and hopefully the new edition just does some of that work for the reader, does some of that work for the keeper, to make it easier for them to take it on and run it themselves.
Yeah.
I think you did a great job were writing the game. And I know both of them quite well. Okay, we have some more questions from the audience. Which things in the first edition you find giving bugs or errors, and which ones you had to fix working on the last edition? Do you find any bugs or errors you discovered and fixed?
I'm not sure bugs and errors is the right word, Paul. What would you say?
Are we talking about the main rule book or the masks?
I think the main rule book.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about a book that came out in 1981, and since then, you know, a lot has developed in gaming, in role-playing games. So lots of new ideas have come to the table, and we were able to draw upon those. So it wasn't so much that they were necessarily bugs, but I mean, like Mike said earlier, with the grapple rules, yeah, individuals, you know, perhaps listening now, you're going to say, well, I used it and the grapple worked fine. But I can remember sitting in a room with a bunch of people playing Mountains of Madness, and somebody said about the grapple rules, and there were 3 experienced keepers. This is well before 7th edition, 3 experienced keepers, and they all disagreed about how grapple worked. So it's like, yeah, for individually, for each of them, it probably worked, but it worked differently. And I think we all have to accept that, you know, so that just didn't seem right to me. So we wanted to try and make it more, perhaps to simplify it or to make it, to communicate it more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, there's, you know, the first edition was great at this time, but you know, things have moved on, and even second edition changed a lot of what was in first edition. You know, a lot of things. I think in first edition you couldn't get sanity back at all, and by second edition that had been introduced. So you know, there were things in first edition that had already been changed in terms of how the game worked. But yeah, I think I wouldn't necessarily call them, you know, bugs. I just think, you know, games evolve. Players expect more, or expect certain difference in things, and so you know, the 7th edition was just basically a bit of modernizing what was a 30-year-old system at the time.
And it was those early editions that Mike and myself fell in love with. So you know,
yeah, we have nothing wrong with them.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left, so I would like to thank you both for this conversation. It was lovely to meet you. It was lovely to converse with you. And if you would like to share something with our audience, now is the time. We have the last 2.5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure talking. If you want to, I mean, I guess I'll just say where you can find me. If you want to talk further, I'm at Paul Fricker on Twitter. And I'm also one of the hosts of the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast. And I'm publishing scenarios on the Miskatonic repository.
Cool. Yeah, I'm at Mike Mason on Twitter. But if you go to the chaosium.com webpage and sign up for our newsletter, you'll pretty much hear everything that I'm involved in terms of the latest books and news and things like that. So yeah, come along to Chaosium and have a look at what we're doing.
Okay, so thank you both. We were talking with Paul Fricker and Mike Mason, co-creators of Call of Cthulhu 7th edition, and I am the translator of the Polish edition because I didn't interview. I didn't set who I am, so that's now the time. Thank you one more time. Thank you, the audience.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.